Since its inception, Margaret Mead's book, Coming of Age in Samoa, has played a pivotal role in the development of future anthropologists' education and the average person's understanding of what anthropology is, bringing the holistic nature of anthropology to the world and making her one of the most famous anthropologists of her time. Years after her work was published, the Australian anthropologist Derek Freeman would come forward against Mead's work, stating that it was misleading and did not accurately reflect Samoan society at the time. Derek Freeman's argument against Mead's work gained a substantial amount of traction in academia at the time of its release. Were his main points against Coming of Age in Samoa backed with evidence? Was he targeting her for being a woman in a field dominated by men? And if his argument had structure, what could that mean for the current anthropology field who uses her research so heavily? In 1926, Margaret Mead set out to Samoa in order to study adolescence and the parallels between Samoan culture and American at the request of Franz Boas, her professor. During her time in Samoa, she primarily studied adolescent girls' sexual life and how culture influenced their psychosexual development. She spent 9 months in Samoa studying the culture and during her time there lived with an American family. Many of Mead's findings showed that Samoan adolescence was much different than the transition American youth go through. Mead found that youth were more sexually active and that society didn't place great pressure on saving yourself for marriage, as is done in America. Instead, great pressure was put on being a contributor to the community as a whole, with expectations of helping the family placed on you at a young age. Growing up and transitioning from child to adult seemed painless and fun compared to America's view of teenager years being embarrassing and traumatic. Mead also talked about how being in a polyamorous relationship was socially acceptable. In 1964, Margaret Mead visited Australia and met Derek Freeman. They had a public meeting in an auditorium where Freeman presented his disagreements to Mead, which eventually led to a heated argument. After the meeting, they kept in touch through letter writing. In one of Mead's letters to Freeman, she goes over the disparities in her work that he had brought to her attention. Apparently, Mead's response was not enough for Freeman, because he went on to publish his work, Margaret Mead in Samoa, The Making and Unmaking of an Anthropological Myth, in 1984. In Freeman's book, he wrote about his research in Samoa and the 2 years he spent there doing ethnographic work in an attempt to refute Mead's research. In Freeman's main arguments against Mead's work, he stated that life in Samoa was not as relaxed and liberal as she had made it out to be. This included Mead's statements of adolescent girls' sexual promiscuity. Freeman said that Mead had been lied to by her informants and that premarital sex was not socially acceptable. Freeman felt that Mead had went into her research with the idea of absolute cultural determinism, so when her informants had told her that they were sexually active, this supported that idea. He also stated that Mead was ill-prepared for her work and was projecting her own promiscuity onto young Samoan girls. Freeman stated that a reason he knew Mead was wrong about Samoa being a sexually permissive culture was because teen pregnancy was not a problem. During their meeting in 1964, they had argued about what counted as being sexually active to Samoans. Since both Mead and Freeman come from Eurocentric backgrounds, they both agreed that vaginal intercourse between a man and woman was sex, but in Mead's work it seems that many of the Samoan youth were not having vaginal intercourse, but instead doing other sexual activities to avoid pregnancy. Freeman went to great lengths to find Mead's informants during his time in Samoa. Although he was able to talk to local chiefs who knew of her and told him that she had been with a Samoan man during her time there, he was only able to find one informant and asked her to recount what she had told Mead. Apparently, the informant, who at the time was a teenager, had jokingly lied to Mead about her sex life. Many scholars have since criticized Freeman for going back to interview Mead's informant so many years later. When looking at Freeman's interactions with the people of Samoa, we have to recognize that he visited Samoa around 40 years after Mead. Samoa had since become a colonized area that had taken on Christianity. It seems also silly to imagine that the informant would have been honest with him about her teenage sexual encounters, since Christianity is so against premarital sex. This made it hard to dismiss Mead's work over one interview Freeman had 40 years later. After reading through many anthropologist accounts of Derek Freeman and his research, it seems that he's widely dismissed by the anthropology community. Even anthropologists who are critical of Mead's work still agree that Freeman did not present enough evidence to refute her work. A notable person who had actively criticized Freeman's work was Paul Shankman, who had rejected Freeman's research, stating that he shaped it to give him the findings he wanted and that he over-exaggerated these findings. Many of his colleagues who worked with him at the Australian National University thought he was crazy and said he was misogynistic and frequently mistreated his female students. Although there may be discrepancies in Margaret Mead's research and is problematic in ways Freeman never expressed, her work is still valuable to the anthropology community and widely renowned to this day. Derek Freeman did have good points and questions regarding Mead's work, which seemed to be properly addressed not only by Mead, but the current generation of anthropologists who study her work with discretion. Freeman's work, however, has been rejected by the anthropology community, along with many other academic institutions worldwide. It seems that his attack on Mead may have come from a more personal place, rather than actually caring about honest ethnographic work.